Well, thank you everyone for coming, and if you've been here all week, thank you for sticking it out to the very end. And for those of you joining us online, great to have you, and welcome to the Natural Hazards Mitigation Association Symposium. So my name is Kirsten Orwig, and I'm with Swiss Re. I'm an atmospheric perils specialist in their catastrophic perils R&D group. And we are very pleased to have a couple of speakers here to talk to us about the insurance industry and understanding catastrophe insurance, particularly. Michael Cohen is with Renaissance Re. He's the Vice President for Government Affairs. And unfortunately, I can't get to the bios on my laptop, so he's going to introduce himself. But before he does that and gets into his presentation, I wanted to kind of give you an idea of what this session is going to look like. We are going to have Michael and Brandon both present, and then we'll have about 30 minutes of discussion. And so we would really like to get the audience involved. And those of you online, if you have questions, please send them in, and we'll try and address those as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you. I'm not even sure we really need the microphone in this room, but we'll use it for now. So I'm Mike Cohen. In addition to being the Vice President of Government Affairs at Renaissance Re, I am also the Director of our Risk Sciences Foundation. So we try and invest and encourage issues around mitigation and protecting hazards. There we go. So I've been asked to kind of explain what reinsurance is, which I think is a fair question, because before I started working in the industry, I really had no idea what it was. So I think many are like me. And before you can really understand reinsurance, and it's in its simplest form, it's insurance for insurance companies, I think it's helpful to understand insurance a bit. So why does a homeowner buy insurance? Let's take a hypothetical home in Miami where I grew up, and let's say it's worth $100,000. That house hypothetically has a risk of completely burning to the ground once every 100 years. That homeowner can choose to either say, I'm going to take $1,000 for the next 100 years and put it in an account and hope that it's year 100 when the house burns down, so I built up my $100,000 to pay for the loss. Or you can choose to buy insurance. And one of the great things about doing it that way is, first of all, you're not allocating all of that capital over all that time into a fund which may never be tapped. But also, what happens in year 2 or 3 if the house burns down? You've got $2,000 or $3,000, not the $100,000 you need. So that's a way to protect your financial interest. And that works well for you because you've successfully diversified out your risk. The insurance company is able to protect itself because it has not only your house, but let's say 10,000 other houses in Miami. So if there's a couple of fires a year, it's bringing in enough in premiums to cover those losses and still make a bit of a profit. And that works well for them, unless all 10,000 houses or a substantial number of them get destroyed at the same time, which happens in major catastrophes. So the insurance company then ends up being in the same boat as that original homeowner, where they are now exposed to potentially losing many of their properties at one time without having built up that much in premium to pay for them. So they can choose to say, we're going to get a lot of capital and hold it over here on the side, and so if we do have major catastrophic losses, we can pay for them out of our reserve. Or they can choose to buy reinsurance. And reinsurance does, in fact, hold that massive amount of capital ready to be deployed at any time. So if there's a disaster 24 to 48 hours later, there's a several billion-dollar check going to an insurance company. Now, how does that work from a reinsurance perspective? So how are they protected? The answer is they diversify out their risk. So a reinsurance company who's taking catastrophic risk like this is going to try and protect against the risk of hurricanes in Florida but they're also simultaneously taking risk from California for earthquakes and Australian flooding and New Zealand risk and every other kind of hazard you can imagine, figuring they're not all going to happen at the same time. And generally that's true. We've had a year or two where it feels like we've had almost every possible disaster occurring at the same time. But typically that's how it works. So by diversifying it out, you make it extremely unlikely that all of these things are going to happen at the same time. You're able to not only take that risk, but also to therefore lower the costs for the insurance company and for the homeowner because that risk is diversified out. So this is a look at what's been going on in the amount of capital in the reinsurance market over the last, call it 10 years. What you see is a pretty dramatic increase over the last 5 or 6 years. That's driven by a couple of factors. One is we simply haven't had volume of disasters in the last 4 or 5 years that we've had in previous decades. Sandy was in there. But besides Sandy, there really hasn't been a major disaster that's eating up a lot of this capital that's being held by these reinsurance companies. So it's been building up steadily. The other aspect of it is with interest rates being very low, there are investors around the world looking for a place to put that capital. And they're either doing it into traditional reinsurance companies, which is the blue top bar, or into what we call alternative capital. And that's an ever-growing slice. So you can see it was very flat until the financial crisis. And then when interest rates bottomed out, capital from Wall Street and other places started to look for a place to go. And reinsurance has been one of those. So it's, call it $20 billion a year in growth into that sector. And just a brief word about what that means, because it gets to be a little complicated, but typically alternative capital is coming in through what we call insurance-linked securities, ILSs. And that typically takes the form of a catastrophe bond. So rather than this traditional insurance vehicle that we've been talking about, where you're just kind of taking the risk in layers up, a cat bond would be for a specific risk or basket of risks. So the California Earthquake Authority could get a cat bond, and they do. And what that says is you, investor, are going to be paying into a bond, so you're going to give us money, and it's going to be for this year, let's say this calendar year. If there's an earthquake, well, let's say if there's not an earthquake, we're going to pay you 3% return on your investment. If there is an earthquake, we're going to pay you less than 3% because we're having to pay out from the funds you've given us, to the point in some cases where the cat bond can actually go negative and you can lose some or all of your principal. So it becomes a bit of a risky take. Again, you're kind of gambling on whether a disaster is going to hit that particular pool that year. And the returns are not very high, but they are higher than the current interest rates, so that's become an appealing place for large institutions to park some of their money as a way to diversify their risk, because you're not necessarily exposing that to the stock market. You're putting it in something else that's not at all correlated with what's going to happen in the stock market. So this I thought would be a helpful quick exercise here. Here's hopefully what natural hazard mitigation looks like, which is homes on stilts.
Enter the conference.
Homes on stilts on the coast.
Press 1 to enter the conference.
And then what climate change adaptation looks like. Homes on stilts. So my point here is, I think too often these two different communities feel like they're talking about different things and their own expertises, and there isn't really the overlap necessary. Because ultimately when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about still the same disasters. They may be more frequent, they may be occurring in different places, but ultimately we're still talking about trying to protect from natural hazards. I mean, one possible difference with climate change adaptation is these stilts may need to be a couple feet higher. But we're not talking about very different animals here, and so I just continue to urge that these communities try and integrate to the extent possible. So I'm often asked, how can insurance companies and insurance be used as a mechanism to help with mitigation? And the answer is a simple but a powerful one, and that is through risk-based rates. So if the price you're charging for insurance is tied to the risk that that homeowner or business or property owner has, then you're sending them a very important signal about how much risk they have. It's directly tied to how much they're paying for the insurance. If we're not sending that message and that signal, then they're not getting enough information to accurately make a determination about what they're being exposed to. Beyond that, there's no incentive then, at least from the insurance standpoint, for somebody to try and reduce that risk. If we're charging them the appropriate rate tied directly to their risk, they can mitigate the risk, they can lower their risk, and then they're going to be able to therefore lower the risk-based pricing. And I think too often with various insurance systems, we're losing that message. The National Flood Insurance Program is an example where rates are subsidized and not even for any of the properties tied directly to the risk of that property. They're done in large swaths in different zones, and so you don't have any sense of what your flood risk is, nor do you have any incentive whatsoever to try and mitigate it, because ultimately you're not really going to be able to affect the price you're being charged very much. That's not true in certain cases with the flood insurance program, so you can elevate and try and change your risk that way. But it's not a very clean system right now. And one of the consequences of these programs has been that we're actually not only discouraging and providing disincentives to live in hazardous areas, but we're actually providing incentives for people to move into hazardous areas. So when we're not charging enough, we're telling people, we, taxpayers, will take the risk for you, and we'll keep rebuilding you if you're in the same place multiple times. So if we look at this chart here, you'll see that the number of presidentially declared disasters has been increasing pretty dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years. And that's a factor of, one, more people moving into hazardous areas. So we're concentrating the risk in more and more dangerous places. But beyond that, it's also been a good political tool to declare a disaster. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the disasters that were declared were the Sandys, were the Katrinas. Those were always presidentially declared disasters. What's changed over time is the smaller and smaller disasters are getting presidential declarations. So a small amount of flooding, a big thunderstorm sometimes will get a declaration if it's done enough damage. It's a great way for the president and the administration to say, I care, I'm doing something about it. But that has a cost. So it's more and more federal resources being poured in to smaller and smaller disasters that typically in the past were handled at the municipal or the state level. And to me, this is pretty dramatic. If you look at how much money we were spending Hurricane Diane, call it 5% of the total cost was borne by federal taxpayers versus Sandy, where it was 80%. So, and these were areas that had a lot of insurance, and yet 80% of it was still going out of federal coffers, which I will argue is completely unsustainable if you look at how much the Sandy appropriation was. $50 billion, which was more than all of those agencies their annual budget. It was more than the Department of Homeland Security's annual budget. So FEMA's budget and every other entity within the Department of Homeland Security was eclipsed by what was spent in one swipe of the pen to pay for Sandy. And that aid has a direct impact on people's decisions. I mean, it only makes sense. What this says is, for every $1,000 in grant aid that we're giving, people then make the decision following that to buy, call it $6,000 less in flood insurance. And what we are doing is conditioning people to expect a grant, a bailout, versus prudent financial planning. And the more money that gets poured in just straight out of a grant, the less people are going to try and protect themselves. In California right now, the earthquake insurance uptake rate is right around 10%. It was 45% before Northridge. So people in California, and there are a number of complicated reasons why people aren't buying earthquake insurance, but one of them is that they feel like they don't need it. And they may feel like they don't need it because they're not going to be the ones that get hit by an earthquake. Or it may be that they feel like they can better protect themselves by not having insurance and self-insuring. But I think a lot of the people will tell you that they expect, after Katrina, after Sandy, after all these other disasters, that the federal government's going to come in and pay for California to rebuild. Although I will say, given how hard it was to get the Sandy appropriation through Congress, I'm not sure that will happen, or if it will happen, it's not going to be real quick. But that continues to be the mindset of a lot of people in the country right now, is when I get damaged, it's the federal government's job to come and help me out. One thing I just wanted to point out is I think green infrastructure typically has gotten less attention than the build environment, but I think the only way we're going to really be able to protect ourselves over the next 30 to 40 years, I don't think we can build our way out of it. I think we've got to find ways to live harmoniously with nature. We've got to find ways to utilize what's already there as protections and to build others, whether that's sand dunes, whether that's marshes, whether that's barrier islands. We've got to find ways to use our natural systems. And I'm encouraged to see that there's more and more research going into that area, so I'm hopeful that that's going to continue to bear fruit for us. And something else I just wanted to flag, hopefully for later conversation, is a lot of attention gets paid to the built environment and to businesses, to single-family homes when we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about disaster response and recovery. Much less time and energy is spent focusing on the lower income communities. And they're the ones that are most at risk in disasters. They're in the least good housing. They're in the most dangerous and risky areas. They probably have much less ability to evacuate. They may not own their own car. They may not be able to get out of town. And communications are limited in some cases. They don't necessarily have internet access. They may not have cell phones. They may not be getting the message in a timely fashion about what's going on. So we need to really, I think about this community as we plan for disasters. Public housing, Section 8 housing, rental properties, these are all areas where I think mitigation is heavily, definitely needed. And beyond that, the residents don't have the power to do the mitigation themselves. Even if they had the money, they're not the ones that own the building. So they are pretty much at the mercy of the landlord or the building owner. So we've talked a bit about reinsurance. We've talked about the fact that reinsurance takes on a lot of the risk that's not currently in the federal government from natural catastrophe. And therefore we, A, have done a lot of time and research on mitigation, and B, feel it's both our duty to share this information, and also there's certainly a financial aspect to it, which is if we can reduce the risk, then potentially we will have fewer claims. So Renaissance Re has put together our Risk Sciences Foundation, and through that foundation we have done a mitigation leadership forum series where we've had about 10 or 12 forums to have conversations much like this, bring in all aspects of the conversation together to try and talk about it, try and come up with solutions, and try and get this more to the public consciousness. And it hasn't just been Renaissance Re, Swiss Re, Munich Re, and others have been at the forefront of really trying to lead this effort. And potentially there's a video here I want to show you, if it plays. In addition to just talking about mitigation, the insurance industry has been very active in trying to push the envelope in learning about it. So the insurance industry has funded an institute called the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. There's a testing facility that's been built in South Carolina that is gigantic. It's got I don't know, 110 8-foot fans that are capable of generating a Category 4 hurricane force winds. We can circulate the winds in there, so it's like a hurricane. They can inject up to 8 inches of rain an hour, so you can really imitate the effects of a hurricane. And it's not just for hurricane. You test hail in there, wildfire, potentially even earthquake, really every hazard except flood currently. And so the idea here is much like we had crash test dummies and we were crashing cars, here we can crash houses and start to see how they come through a disaster. And hopefully learn better ways to develop building materials and building techniques. So the example I have here is a test from last year. It's a manufactured home, and what we've learned is much of the damage done to a manufactured home in a hurricane from the wind is not directly to the manufactured home itself, but to the structures that people attach to the outside of it, be it a carport or something else like that. And hopefully this will run, and if not, I'll describe it. Okay, it won't run. So what this test showed was that the typical carport is just kind of abutting to the manufactured home. And what happens is the wind gets into the carport and smashes it into the manufactured home. So they ran the test showing that, and the manufactured home gets completely destroyed by the carport blowing into it. Then they reran the test by putting a simple brace on the carport so it didn't move. And the manufactured home came through fine. So that's just one example of the type of research we're trying to conduct to really get a better handle on solutions that may not be all that costly. So, I mean, putting a brace on a carport compared to the cost of the carport or the home is negligible, but it protects them from loss in the event of a storm. So hopefully we'll continue to be doing more research along those lines, hopefully in partnership with some of you. And we can start to solve this and get mitigation more in the forefront of people's minds. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. And we'll go ahead and take one question specific to Michael's presentation. Yes, the gentleman in front. Keith?
Oh, me, okay. This is the Father Christmas
Hold
question.
on, please use
Sorry.
the microphone so we can capture it on the webinar.
This is a Father Christmas question because mitigation involves who's been naughty and who's been nice. In 2008, there were a lot of failures in the reinsurance industry looking at client levels that failed at high quality assurance, high standards, but they failed. And so a lot of the research that's gone into that said, well, they didn't really have quality assurance policy. They didn't really have a mitigation policy. They had a sort of man in the room. And I know there's a lot of research going on at the reinsurance, the insurance industry, is how do you set up policies of doing it right in determination that mitigation really works properly? Because if it's just a label, we're going to have the same problem with sustainability and QA today. How do you drive best practices from the reinsurance end to ensure that people are doing it right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways. One is just better communication. So you've got to really, to the extent you've got information, be sure you're sharing it, not just with your clients, who in our case would be the insurance companies, but also the insurance companies are then able to pass that along to their customers and their clients. Some of this, I think, also comes down to government taking a role. So to the extent we're able to determine what the best practices are and what the right practices are, then it comes down to putting in place good regulations, good building codes, for instance, to ensure that people are doing what they need to do. And as long as we're able to keep the risk-based prices there, then you've got the incentives aligned that they ought to want to do mitigation and not just say, well, it doesn't matter, when it gets knocked down, somebody else is going to rebuild it and I'm not really paying for it, so I don't care. We need to make sure people have skin in the game so they care.
All right, well, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Brandon Katz from JLT Re, also a reinsurance company. He was formerly with Risk Management Solutions, risk assessment modeling firm, and he's going to actually talk to us about how risk assessment is done in the insurance industry.
Hello, everybody. Hopefully you guys can hear me all right. So before I get started, I actually just want to piggyback on something that Michael mentioned and tell a very quick story. He was talking about trying to motivate people in terms of the National Flood Insurance Program, like during Hurricane Sandy. So I was at the PCI flood event in D.C. about 2 months ago, and I heard a story from somebody who had a home in the area that was pretty affected by Sandy. And the story she told was very interesting. So she had herself as a character flood to her neighbor. So herself, she had built her home, she had invested the money to put it on stilts, and in order to mitigate her risk and sort of take her out of the A zone. And then there was a reevaluation of the zones after she finished that construction. She found out that she now had to go and add another 2 feet to her stilts. And her neighbor had decided not to purchase flood insurance at all. Hurricane Sandy hit, and her neighbor got bailed out by the government. So when we talk about disincentives for mitigation, excuse me, I think that's one area we can look at in terms of how that works. So that's, I think, a story that I think is very pertinent for folks in this room, and so we're trying to motivate them. So I just want to share that story. So I wanted to give a quick introduction to myself. As you said, RMS is where I used to work. My background is I'm a meteorologist and atmospheric physicist. I've been working for the last 6 to 7 years in hydrology. May not seem like a connection, but we always think of water as very heavy air, so the equations still work. So at RMS, I spent about 6 years there previous to being at JLT Re. There I co-developed the China typhoon flood model, co-developed the European flood model, the US flood model, North American hurricane model, so modeling storm surge, modeling we typically refer to as pluvial and fluvial flood, because we love complicated terms, but basically pluvial is basically sort of flash flood risk. You can think of water coming into the water. Fluvial is water coming out of the river, so actual risk from the river. Both of these are really important. I think I recall yesterday during one of the meetings discussing about the Colorado floods, is it water coming out of the river, is water coming into the river, and is the NFIP really covering both of those questions? So we do think it's really important when modeling these things to make sure you're modeling all sources of floods, whether it's on the floodplain or off the floodplain. So go ahead and jump in the presentation so I don't want to take up too much time, so you have as much time for discussion as possible. So what am I going to talk about today? So I'm more on the physics side. I've been working with this for about 7 years now in the insurance industry, developing flood models, specifically and other models for the insurance industry so we can use them. So I want to quickly take you guys through what is we typically refer to as a CAT model, catastrophe model. How do we develop them and how are they used? What do we use them for? And then I want to have a quick tie-in together at the end to sort of talk about how they could possibly be applied to risk mitigation. Okay, so that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into it. So the first thing I wanted to do is orient you guys. We talked about CAT models. We talked about flood. We talked about wind. What are the hazards that are typically modeled from the insurance and reinsurance perspective? There's a couple. These are the main ones, I would say. We have earthquake, and there's typically a lot of times a secondary hazard. So you have earthquake and you have fire following earthquake, of course. You have earthquake hit. We also have to model stuff like the breakages of gas lines that can cause conflagration and fire. We model winter storms. There's a lot of hazards associated with winter storm. There's ice buildup that causes roof damage. There's temperatures decreasing, which causes pipe bursts. Various things that we model for winter storm. Severe convective storm actually has 3 components. The primary 2 are, of course, hail, as you would imagine, and tornadoes. The third being typically referred to technically as derecho winds, but straight line winds, events that happen. Terrorism is an interesting one that's been a big subject in the last couple of years, modeling things like nuclear attacks, chemical attacks, bombs, these kind of things. Those are modeled and insured and reinsured. Hurricanes, storm surge loss with a backup of hurricane force winds. We've got flood perils, which we've already kind of discussed, so I won't go too much into that. There's infectious diseases, which are modeled, which is interesting. And of course, there's also a whole other host of life risks. So anything you can imagine being insured, we try and model something that does that. So most of these models, infectious disease aside, typically we're modeling them in terms of property damage. What's the loss to the structure, what's the loss of the contents. But we also try and model these things in terms of workers' compensation. And where I think that applies to here, when you think about workers' compensation, you think about death, destruction, you think about people not being able to get to work, or you think about people getting injured. So I think there's also a connection in terms of the human impact using the workers' compensation models. So we're using similar models for all those things. These are all the models that we typically model. There's a few other ones in there, but these are the major ones that we take care of. So the next question is, how in the world do we model these things? How does a CAT model work? So I'm going to take you through sort of the general framework that almost all of these natural catastrophes go through in terms of modeling. First thing we do is generate what's called a stochastic event set. Now you might say, hey, what's a stochastic event set? I'll just give you an example using hurricane. What you can think of for a stochastic event set is we know what the history is. You can go to HERDAT or HERDAT2, for instance, as a data source for hurricane tracks. For each track, you have a central pressure. We have a lot of data over the last fairly long record. But we also know that that's not going to cover everything that could possibly happen, right? We have a lot of events that maybe occurred before the record, or maybe occurred during the record that weren't observed because there weren't as many people around observing observational bias issues. So what we do is we use a combination of the historical data and geostatistics in order to try and extend this total range of events. So you can imagine perhaps between Miami, Florida, and Jacksonville, you may have had X number of storms in the historical record, but you know that any one of those storms that hit anywhere between Jacksonville, Florida, and Miami, there could be any number of storms that hit any other place within that region from north to south. And you can imagine maybe there's never been a Cat 4 or Cat 3 or something like that, but hey, there could be. There could be a Cat 5, there could be a Cat, or Cat 1s. So what we do with stochastic modeling is we try and fill in those gaps that we perceive to be there using the statistics and the historical record. So that what we do is we then model every single potential event that we think could happen. And we do that in a combination with just actually how the events occur, and of course we apply rates. So Florida is going to get more hurricanes than, say, Massachusetts. Massachusetts doesn't have zero risk, but it's got a very much lower risk. Of course, we talk about Nova Scotia, but you after having really huge storm surges. It's actually a Canadian hurricane center, which I found out a couple years ago, because they have really ridiculous storm surges up there, actually the Nova Scotia area, the Bay of Fundy and all those areas. So that's what a stochastic model is, hurricane. You also have, of course, like severe convective storm, for instance. We have SPC reports in the United States. We have tornado tracks. So you can imagine the same operation. Each one of those little red dots there in the bottom right is actually a line segment for what a tornado track was, as well as information about what where it was on the scale. And you can imagine changing the orientation of each one of those tornadoes and moving them up and down and getting a full view of what all the different types of events could be. So that's what it's called stochastic event set generation. Okay? So now we have hurricane tracks. We have basically squall lines. You can think of when you look at the radar. We have those things. Now what do we do with those things? Now we have to actually assess the hazard and create what we call hazard footprints. I won't belabor this point too much, but this is actually where really most of the physics come in. It's not so hard to get these storm traps, but where it gets really hard is how do you then turn it into a floodplain? How do you then turn that into a map of wind speed for a single event? And I'm not going to go too much into that because the methodologies is really where you start to get into a lot of the science and a lot of the equations and these kind of things. But you can just imagine running a stochastic event sense. Typically we have between 25,000 and 50,000 events that we model, depending on the type of hazard. And you basically end up with a bunch of different footprints that have varying levels of flood, for instance. Or earthquake, varying levels of types of earthquake. You can have slip faults, you can have, what are the other faults? It's a couple of different modes, basically. I'm blanking on them, unfortunately, right now. I'm sure someone in the room knows. But you can have different, excuse me?
Subduction.
I guess subduction faults, these kind of things. So you can have different types of earthquakes. You can have different magnitudes of earthquakes. There's a couple different parameters that determine what's the depth of the epicenter, these kind of things. What is the soil type between where you live and where the fault is, and that affects how the shake actually propagates to the soil. So you can imagine you can have a lot of different events with different types of shake for earthquake, different types of flood, different types of hailstone, different types of all these things. So you've got your stochastic event set. You then create a bunch of different footprints, say between 25 and 50,000 depending on the hazard. Then we apply vulnerability. This is actually where the insurance industry, and especially the places that I used to work for, RMS and some other companies as well, spend a lot of their time. They create what are called vulnerability or damageability curves. Similar to what HAZUS has created for, say, storm surge from FEMA. So there's a couple different ways to approach this. There's computer models, which I know there's a lot of work on that. Say it's an RMS, where they actually have a building in some program software. They have doors, they've got windows, and they're evaluating the actual wind pressure load, say for wind, on each one of these surfaces to figure out what point in time they buckle. Now, of course, there's an uncertainty that's modeled around these, so that you have an idea of what the envelope is of how certain you are about these vulnerability curves. But you create these vulnerability curves for every single type of hazard for many different types of buildings. So you're going to have a different vulnerability curve for a single-family dwelling, for a multifamily dwelling, for masonry, for a number of floors, for a basement. My favorite secondary modifier is called missiles, where you have an idea of what the size of your trees are in your yard and distribution of those trees and other things in your yard that can actually act as a missile to destroy your home. So actually hundreds and hundreds of these vulnerability curves that are created for different types of buildings, for different types of hazards. Okay? So there's the actual computational models, and of course, this is sort of an example of what these vulnerability curves can look like. They're not usually just a transformation of the same one. Of course, the shapes change. And of course, the other option is to do sort of stuff that Michael talked about earlier, and actually put it on a shake table. They actually do build these large buildings to code. They put them on a shake table, or they subject them to wind or hail or any other type of hazard, and they figure out what the effects are, and they create the vulnerability curves this way. So it's a very labor-intensive, a very scientific process that's gone through. We try to take care of as many of the variables as we can think of to take care of. So of course, you get more vulnerability curves. So now we've got the hazard for every single location for a bunch of different footprints. We know how that hazard should affect each building. Now all we do simply is calculate the damage. This is a relatively simple process. For flood, imagine you've got two buildings. Let's say that there's a flood line for one event. Let's say the values are exactly the same. There we go. But you can imagine you have your vulnerability curve. Typically for flood, a lot of times for the actual structure, when you get the first floor, you've got some drop off, and the second floor, you have different drop off. For modeling contents, it changes because most people put their most expensive contents on the first floor, so it goes up much faster, so we take these things into account. And then you just simply evaluate what percentage of your damage that you have for each building. So for each footprint then, you have for each building what the loss is. We call it an event loss table. Okay? So we've got that. We call it the ground up loss. I'm sorry, the gross ground up loss. Yeah. And then I'm not going to belabor this too much because I know this will be of various interest to folks, but you have a couple different perspectives. Let's say you're the insurer versus the insuree. If you're the insurer, you guys all know about deductibles and limits. I'm sure you all have auto policies and home policies. You have one perspective what your loss is. Maybe the ground up loss is always the same, but whether you're just paying this $20K deductible if you're the homeowner or if you're the insurer, you do 150 minus 20. Pretty obvious, right? Then we start getting into the reinsurer perspective, and things get a little bit more complicated. You've got a lot of these individual policies in a portfolio. Sometimes you'll buy a single portfolio. Sometimes you'll buy a bunch of different portfolios from a bunch of different companies. And you'll aggregate them in some way. So you start to get kinds of language that we call attachment points. Sometimes instead of deductible, these things can be in different places. You've got different layers. Then maybe you don't grab the whole thing. You just sort of partition it into different layers. And then you have different companies come in and buy those reinsurance layers. So it can become kind of complicated. So let's say you've got 3 different companies that want to buy that layer from 200 million attachment point or excess of $100 million. So it becomes very complicated, these structures. Sometimes we'll have folks not want to buy part of the layer, like blue areas, so you don't always have 100% participation. So I'm not going to belabor this. I don't think, just give you a general idea that the insurance and reinsurance industry can be relatively complex when you start to build these things up. But I show this to you because I want to show you what does CAP modeling tell us and how do we use it in the industry. So we create 2 primary metrics, I would say. We have exceedance curves, exceedance probability curves, which tell you for a specified return period what's the loss. So just as an example here, you can look at this 2 different ways. You can say this portfolio will experience a loss of X on average once every 1,000 years, but we try not to word it that way because then people think that, oh, if we have a 1 in 1,000 year event this year, can you have a 1 in 1,000 event next year? Yes, you absolutely can. So we typically try and rephrase that, turn it on its head a little bit. We say every year there is a 0.1% chance of an event that causes X loss. That's what these curves tell us. Okay? And this could be for individual locations, or usually it's for a whole portfolio of locations together. We also have what's called the average annual loss, also sometimes referred to as the pure premium. It gives you an idea of what you can, what is your actual, over that full 50,000 years worth of events that we've created that we mentioned, what is the average loss per year that you see? So we have these 2 metrics. It's used for setting premiums. It's used for creating those layers that we mentioned, and it's used for determining exclusion. Should we be insuring you? So we talk about actuarially sound, rates. That's what CAP models help us produce. So we use a combination of these models. Some of the data goes to actuaries, and it gets adjusted, and we end up with these kind of things. So that's really what I think drives. Like for instance, we talk about NFIP or things and trying to figure out what actuarial sound rates. It's using CAP models, using these kind of models. So now, who does this? So I've kind of given you guys a general idea of what CAP modeling is, how complex it can be, who's actually using these models. There's 3 primary companies I would say are kind of the independent world leaders in this thing, shown in no particular order. RMS, Equicat, and AIR worldwide. So when I say independent, that means they're not owned by an insurance company. And in theory, the idea is that they're creating models that are based only on the science and based on basically industry losses that are historic. So the idea is they're independent, so they're agnostic toward insurance company. Okay, now we get into some of the newer ones. This has become very interesting because for a long time, those are really the only players, those three companies. Of course, there were some academic models, which we'll talk about in a minute, but for the most part, they were it. But it's becoming a much more variegated field as computing power becomes cheaper and as people become more educated in these things. So we have, I apologize for the messed up animation here, three companies, Cat Risk, JBA, and the Florida Public Hurricane Loss Model. There's other ones as well, but what's interesting about this is these are actually all three of these companies, they only model flood. Of course, you could argue that there's also a wind component to the Florida Public Hurricane Loss Model. And so flood's becoming, of course, a big conversation issue in insurance. It's probably, well, of course I work in flood, so I think it's the most important one, but other people may disagree with me. Those are the insurance-focused companies. They specifically develop these things for the insurance industry. There are, of course, a lot of different players, and you guys are, I'm sure, aware of most of these. Female engineers, lots of government institutions are doing this, lots of educational institutions are building models, and of course the insurance industry is certainly watching and interested to get as much information as they can. Lots of loss modeling platforms that are becoming either less expensive or free. Oasis is an example. So we talked about all those things where you have those vulnerability curves, you have to compute uncertainty and create those exceedance probability curves and AELs. There's a few players, Oasis being the biggest one really right now, that are building these types of models. Actual loss models. Private, of course, I mentioned Swiss Re, because Swiss Re is here. I mentioned GLT, because GLT Re is here. I feel like I should have mentioned Renaissance Re, but
You should have.
Renaissance Re. There's lots more companies than these ones. These are folks that are building, a lot of folks building flood models right now. It's very, very popular, I would say. Very important. This is just basically, if you're an insurance or a reinsurance company, mostly reinsurance companies, I guess I would say, with some primaries for sure, they're probably looking into building their own cat models in some respect, whether it's a stochastic model, whether that's a rate map, as this area has a higher risk in that area, which I think is very important. They're doing it. So GLT, for instance, I focus more on making rate maps. I think that there's a lot to be said where if I'm standing here, the river's right there, and I know I'm not very high, you can get a lot of information by just being able to use that. And you can get a lot out of it by being able to look at that and say, that area's probably going to be flooded very much. It's got a higher risk than somewhere else. So picking topographic indexes and these kind of things. There's lots of different ways to make risk maps versus a stochastic model. There's lots of different ways to approach modeling, and I think as time goes on, we're going to get stochastic models plus other types of models approaching these things. It's good to have a large view of the different ways of modeling these things so then you can really understand what the uncertainty is. What else is out there besides cat models? These are my last couple slides. So what else can we do that our industry looks at in terms of detection and in terms of risk evaluation? There's satellites. We have the MODIS satellite that does gives us a lot of information about, say, where it's wildfires. It's been used in the past for flood detection and flood footprint post-loss detection. There's better satellites that have gone up more recently that actually do a much better job of it, I would say. They have higher resolution. There's drones and orthophotos, people actually flying over events, taking pictures. People throwing drones up there, taking pictures. And because this is the world we live in, there's social media, which is even playing a part. Just to give an idea, lots of different organizations are looking at this. So this is, for instance, from NASA. They figure out areas of high rain to sort of give you an idea of where you would expect floods to occur. Wildfire, I mentioned before, from the MODIS satellite. We have GDEX, which is a new project, which is, I think, utilizes some of the information from those new satellites. It's still being a relatively new thing. There's Google Earth. You can actually go, for instance, the Nashville flood. You can go in there and you can actually change the timeline of when the satellite photo was taken. And they happen to have taken some photos, some orthophotos, I believe, from the Nashville flood. There's other companies that are out there that actually do some very interesting things with flood mapping post-event, exogenesis, perils. And the final slide, pretty much, is social media. So you actually have people during the big Toronto floods recently going out and tweeting about floods. And of course, when you tweet, typically you are geo-tagged, so they know what your latitude and longitude is. So they were looking at places where people mentioned flood and people mentioned depth of flood, and they actually created a map of this, and it did pretty well when they, not everywhere, it did pretty well when they were trying to figure out where the flood was, where the flood was not in Toronto. And of course, there are papers in scientific journals talking about mapping impact footprints using social media and these kind of things. So I want to actually do questions, but now I just kind of want to tie it, my last sort of statements, sort of tying it back to mitigation. So we talked a lot about what the insurance industry does. We talked a lot about, how it helps sort of us as the insurance industry. Now, how does it sort of affect mitigation? Well, of course, one thing you could argue is that making it cost prohibitive to live where you probably shouldn't live. If you're actuarially sound rates, then that's one feature. Also, the insurance industry is very interested in mitigation in terms of where and how much it costs to be a player. Take Shanghai, for instance. Shanghai has one of the most impressive storm surge defense systems in the world. I think they're defended something up to a 1,000-year return period, they say, of course, plus or minus whatever you think the return period should be. But I can guarantee you that they would not have as much insurance buying in that area if they had not mitigated some of that disaster. The insurance industry, people might think we want to charge high rates, we want to do these things, but the preference would be to have the risk much lower and to have plenty of people actually paying for a premium. So the insurance industry is involved, you saw with Michael's conversation, is involved in mitigation. They're interested in making the actual hazard less because it's in our financial interest. And as we know, when we're talking about things politically, to make the change, sometimes financial interest is a very important point to make. We may not like it, but it is the reality. I'm a scientist at heart. I prefer not to have that conversation, but it is the world we live in. Also, there's a lot of information with these vulnerability curves. We're figuring out what types of buildings are more damageable than other buildings. That can sometimes, we have conversations, affect building codes in the future. So some of that information, some of that research is done with government entities, with public entities, so there's some share going on there, actually doing these vulnerability studies to figure out how could we build buildings a bit better. The last thing is there's a lot of interesting things. So Cat Risk I mentioned is one interesting company. So they actually have some partnerships with Oak Ridge National Lab. They're actually using the Titan supercomputer for their flood model. It's a flood model on 10-meter resolution for the entire United States. It's a huge amount of data. Most people think you can't do it. I've done it myself. I've seen it done, and it works very well. But the only way that it can be done is through these partnerships with places like Oak Ridge National Lab. They actually license, or actually use some of the compute time. They use all of the Titan supercomputer GPUs, so using GPUs to model flood. So I would say that a lot of times you can view the insurance industry, because we're so motivated, as sort of pushing the envelope on what models can do and what they do. I just sort of wanted to show that as an example. People think, hey, these things don't have enough compute resources, but where there's a will, where there's a dollar to be made, there's a way. Hopefully, that starts to filter down. People start to see these things come out. And that's all I got.
All right, thank you very much, Brandon. Do we have one specific question with regards to Brandon's presentation? Yes, in the back. Please come up and use the microphone.
Yeah, I am Nathan Slaughter. I'm a planner for a consulting firm. Work primarily with mitigation planning and that sort of thing, and have used modeling in the past to try to convey risk to the people we work with, and traditionally have used HAZUS or just simple GIS overlay. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on if there's anything for locals to use that's better than HAZUS, maybe easier to use, and just how, I guess, maybe the technology can be translated to local use.
Yeah, so one of the unfortunate things about the industry, or fortunate depending on how you want to look at it in terms of innovation and being able to drive innovation, is that it's not free.
Right.
Typically, companies like Cat Risk are selling maps for relatively reasonable prices, I would say. They do have their own web interfaces that they develop. So there are companies out there that actually do develop these things for general use. It doesn't have to be for the insurance industry. A lot of these companies, like I said, they develop these models not necessarily with the insurance in mind, but not influenced by insurance. They have a lot of these independent guys that you mentioned, right? And so I think it's a good place to look where the tools that are developed for insurance, there's no reason why they can't be used for local planning. One of the things I wrote down, didn't mention for some reason, was that that's one of the big points, I think, of connection. These models can be used for risk differentiation. These models can be used for figuring out areas that are either not built up correctly, because you can tell by looking at the vulnerability curves, or areas that are at risk to these storms, because that's exactly what these models tell us. This area is more risky than this area. So I think that the combination of those, of using these models and developing them for more of a public use, I would say, it's out there, it's not mainstream, but it is available to those that want to start having those conversations. And there's no reason why those conversations shouldn't start. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So I guess HAZUS is still probably HAZUS is probably still the best option for locals because it's free and easily available. You mentioned Oasis. Do you think that's something that is easy enough for a local to use and be able to get information out of?
To set it up, you do have to know a little bit about Linux.
Never mind.
That being said, it's not a huge leap. I've set it up myself before. But the problem with OASIS, it's a loss modeling framework, so you still have to have the maps to stick into that framework, so they have the hazards. That being said, that program is specifically developed. It has a common map format. It also has proprietary RNS format and AR format, like I mentioned before. But any university, anybody that creates maps, there is an ability to actually inject those maps into OASIS and then run it on that framework. So it doesn't have the hazard maps itself, but it is set up to become a framework to be used. And I believe right now it's in beta, so you have to pay to be part of the beta. But I believe the eventual idea is that's going to be low cost or free. Don't quote me on that, but that's the general idea behind it. It's trying to open up the field to other players. Cat model.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to open up our panel discussion. And anybody who has comments, we don't just want to have questions. It would be great to get a dialogue going on here. So any comments or questions, please. Alex, you want to start off?
So Mike, you started off showing some pretty startling slides with some pretty incredible trends about the role of the federal government. Brendan, you told a story at the beginning highlighting that exact problem. And it seems to me that we know what needs to be done in terms of hazard mitigation. We know what has to be done in terms of CAT modeling and insurance. But I'm wondering if the greatest impediment to progress is the antithetical incentive structure that the federal government, either in the US and in places like Canada and other G7 countries, create by encouraging people to make bad decisions. And so we can't actually make progress on all these brilliant ideas that happen in rooms like this until we change the mechanism with which the federal government approaches how they distribute funds to residences, corporates, and even particularly communities and cities that are discouraged from taking proactive decisions because they know on the backside they'll be made whole, or mostly whole, by the federal government and by the rest of the taxpayers. So I guess my question is this. What can we do as an industry, collectively, insurance, modeling, practitioners, engineers, to force this conversation and have a real look at how to change the culture that we've created of risk shifting as opposed to risk ownership?
Well, first, I'm happy to answer it, but I just wonder if there's anybody else in the room that wants to try and take a stab at that. I think Ed does.
Ed does. Hi, I'm Ed Thomas from the National Hazard Mitigation Association. And I'd like to pass on, for the sake of discussion, a concept that was developed by the American Bar Association in 2009, where the only people that can speak for the American Bar Association, the House of Delegates, voted on something for a 400,000 member organization that essentially indicated that they endorsed the concept of universal catastrophic insurance made affordable by driving down the risks and consequences of disasters through zoning, building codes, and incentives to fix existing problems. I think that this was in part a response to the problems of Katrina that continue unto this day. I don't know how many of you saw the closing plenary at the Hazards Workshop, where there was great expressions of pain and suffering that continue in Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and other places because of the extremely well-intentioned, but most charitable thing I could say is the Byzantine system that we had in the United States of paying for disasters, the tremendous cornucopia of money that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York indicates that for every dollar in disaster damage since Katrina, between private market insurance, taking flood insurance off the table, and we'll talk about flood insurance, private market insurance, and government assistance, for every dollar in disaster damage, society is paying $1.25, which is not much of an incentive for doing things differently and better. But we also heard in that closing plenary the outpouring of pain and suffering that, as the Federal Reserve Bank observed in their study on Sandy, that we are not seeing any indication that that surplus, that extra 25%, is going to those who actually suffered the damage. And I think there's pretty clear indication from what we've heard in the plenary and what we've all heard in discussions with folks, that nothing like that surplus is going to the people that are most afflicted. So if we had a process that FEMA described in the last publication of the James Lee Witt era, which was called American Burning Recommissioned Roman numeral II, the preface of that indicates that we know how to do mitigation. And what we have done in the United States and throughout the world over the last 100 years with respect to urban fires is a model. And that would be having communities rated separately on their ability to deal with natural hazards, foreseeable hazards, hydrants spaced appropriately, water supply, and all that. And we would be able to come up with what the insurance world would call a schedule and actually evaluate the ability of a community that will drive down risks and consequences and prevent things from getting worse. If I can add to that, part of this, we need to keep in mind demographic trends. Dr. Arthur Nelson, Chris Nelson, indicates that 50% of the improved square footage of space that we will see in this nation in
Now, but I was the director of the City of Seattle Emergency Management for 12 years and 8.5 years as a director of the state of Washington, was the NEMA president for a couple of years. So I was, some of my remarks are going to kind of flow a little bit, but I don't think the questions have been, won't be much longer than my comment and question. The mythology that exists that FEMA will bail you out, which Mike, you referred to, is propagated in large part by insurance agents who don't want to sell earthquake insurance, for example. They don't want to sell it. They present a very difficult product for people to afford, and not much data behind it other than, hey, if you want it, but don't worry. We had, after the Nisqually quake, which sparked a lot of interest, not much damage, but a lot of interest in earthquake insurance, we have people calling saying, my agent said FEMA will take care of it. More than one. Many calls came in, even though we put out a big push that maybe you ought to think about earthquake insurance. So that's one problem. That's a problem we share. The second piece of this is that try to convince people to change their behavior is interesting because a family member was nearly killed in a car accident, and we went in to sue, as you do after that. The person survives, my wife, and the lawyer said going in, you're going to get every drop of dollars that you have coming to you based on the actuarial tables and all of that. And they'll tell you, hey, we didn't kill her, so we don't have to pay you that much. And we're going to work it out. But none of it, no matter how, and I'm good at this, he said, but I'm not good enough to make you ever want to go through this again. You never want to go through the suffering, the anxiety, the anger, all the other things that you go through. And that's true of disasters as well. And people need that kind of thought process before they're going to change their behavior. And so one of the things that I tried and so far failed to do when I was state director was push an idea that we needed to envision the challenges of recovery with the entire community. I didn't say whole community because that's been expropriated, but it's not. It was expropriated, but it was around for a long time. The whole notion is that what we should probably be doing is looking ahead at what we would have to do to get our transportation systems going, our communication systems going, kids in school, and all of that. And who's affected by that? Just about everybody, industry and everyone else. And the insurance industry needs to sit alongside that and help guide that. Which I've never seen them really willing to do at the local and state level. They're more worried about, well, they're going to ask us to pay for it. And the answer is, no, we want people to buy insurance, but we want to make smart decisions about where we build and where we don't. And you can't have that decision. You aren't going to make a change in policy after Sandy while people are standing in the rubble of their homes. That has to be notionalized and thought through by people in advance, and we tried it in 2012 in an exercise where we attempted to have a lot of time spent on how would we recover from this earthquake we've just made up. How would we do it? We had a capitalization seminar day. We had 3 days of discussions with local, state, and Fed saying, what would we do? And the answer is, we learned a couple things. One, there wasn't enough money in our reserve accounts to meet our immediate response costs. So what happened? the budget guys and the legislators who observed went back and came up with a fix for that. If you go through an exercise and you come to what appear to be insurmountable redevelopment problems or decisions, make those decisions now. Get your legislators and get your attorneys general and your governors and your mayors to say, all right, what would we do if we're not going to go back to this area if it's destroyed?